So over the years, I have really fallen in love with a very specific type of book. Now, this isn't necessarily a genre because I think you can write this type of book in almost any genre, but it's more of like a feeling. And I've had this feeling for a couple of years now, and every time I find a new book to add to this like collection, it's so good. How do I explain it? I don't even know if I can do it justice, but I think to me, it's a type of book that like you read it for the concept. It has a very high concept or specific concept that sounds really, really strange. And you go into it thinking it's going to be about one thing. And then by the midway point, by the end, you're like, wait a minute, that's not what it was about. There is an underlying thing, message, theme, whatever, that is not what the concept made me think it would be about. And so as a result, a lot of this is like things like dark academia books. Ergodic literature is another great example. There's some really high concept things that I think a lot of people go into it expecting to understand, and then they don't, and then they get really frustrated, and then they hate it. And I am not that type of person. I'm the person I will put in all the work for a little bit of payoff because I think it's fun, and because I think you can learn a lot by not knowing. Ooh, we're getting philosophical today, folks. So settle in. I have a list of some book recommendations if you're interested. And I think most of these books actually are really great for this time of year because they're very spooky and cozy, and you should read them on a dark night and read them when it's cold. The first book on this list is a new release. It's coming out October 2020, and it's my favorite book of 2020. It's incredible. It's wonderful. It is probably one of the tamest books on this list because it is the easiest to understand. But I still think it fits the bill because it gives me this really good feeling inside, and it's worth the work of going back and forth between these different timelines. So that book is called The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This book is about a girl named Addie, and she was born in 1800s France. I know. I don't like historical fiction, but I was shocked too. And so it follows the story of her life as she goes from 1800s France to 2014 because she made a deal with the devil, as one does. And so as a result of that deal, she can live forever. However, people won't remember she exists. So anytime somebody closes the door on her, turns away from her, wakes up next to her in bed the next morning, they don't remember who she is, they don't remember why she's there. And so she has to create this life in between the cracks of people, basically, for her whole 200-year lifespan. And so it's very, very interesting because it's kind of paranormal, but it's very much like literary fiction in some ways because it's just a girl living. And I think what really put it on this list for me is that the concept is great, like living forever, making a deal with the devil. That's really, really cool. I want to read about that. But as somebody who is in their mid-20s, it touched me in ways that I did not expect, because the underlying message is very much like, it's about living. And I think that is something that really it makes you think a lot. There's a lot of introspection that comes with this book that even though you go into it for the concept, you go into it for V.E. Schwab and her writing, like it's about you, and that is terrifying. So the next book on this list is a little bit more complex. It kind of falls under the dark academia tone, but it's very supernatural and paranormal, a little bit of fantasy in some ways. And it's called The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This is the same author who wrote The Night Circus, if you've read that. I haven't. Heard they're similar in vibes though. And this is on here because it's so weird. Like you really do have to put in the time to understand the world, to understand what's happening, why it's important. And not a lot of people, I think, have read it because it is so intimidating. And it is kind of, it reads like a high fantasy in the way that you don't really know what's going on. It's the story of a boy named Zachary Ezra Rollins. He is 24. He's a grad student, hence the dark academia. He is in school for part of it. He ends up going to the library and finding this really old book. And in the book, he finds a story about himself. And as one might expect, it's very hard to hear and it's a little bit weird. And so he goes on this adventure to try and figure out who wrote the book, what happened with the book, why is he in this book. And so this is it's a love letter basically to stories and books and writing. And as somebody who loves all those things, I think this book really touched me because it's so personal. Like I've never experienced these specific things, but I think it calls out to me in ways that other books just haven't been able to do, because it is about writing and it is about stories and books, and the ending is so goddamn weird. So you pick it up for the concept of like a magical library type of thing, and you're like, okay, I know what's happening, it's gonna be great. By the end of the book, it makes even less, like every chapter by the end, you're like, it makes less sense, I don't understand it. It makes even less sense because I'm reading more of it. And so once you get to the last chapters, it's not about what you think it's about, and things happen that you didn't think were gonna happen. And it just made me reflect on my life. And I think that's also part of it. With these types of stories, like, yes, you go into it for the concept and there's this new message at the end that you're like, oh my God, my mind is blown. But it's also relating it to yourself. And I think I'm such a person that like, I try to find myself in art all the time. And that's why I love most art. And so all of these books, I never thought I would find myself within their pages. And then I do, and I'm like, whoa, mind blown. This is crazy. Like, I am in this book, except that I'm not, except that I am, you know? Okay, so the next book is arguably the easiest of all of these to understand. It's pretty straightforward. The plot makes sense. There's only a little bit at the end that like flips everything on its head that you're like, whoa, what did I just read? But it is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I've talked about this book a number of times. I read it last fall and it completely changed my worldview. It is, I cannot explain to you how much I love it. Some people don't like it at all. If you've read The Secret History by Donna Tartt, this is a good comp title. That they're similar. They're basically the same, except they're totally different. And part of why I love the dark academia genre is because normally it involves really intense like mystery thriller plots. And so it's usually about a group of friends who may or may not have killed one of their own. And you're like, why would you kill your friend? I don't know. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. If We Were Villains is a dark academia story set in the 90s, and it's about these kids at university who study Shakespeare and acting. And so it's all about Shakespeare. Oftentimes the kids will talk in Shakespearean verse because they're really immersed in their culture and that's how they communicate well. And so it's about this group of friends, and there may or may not have been a murder committed. One of them may or may not be in jail. We don't know. There's a lot going on. Not really sure. And so part of why I love this one so much, again, I went into it for the concept. I knew it was dark academia. Towards the end of the book, it is not really what I signed up for. I did not anticipate it going the way that it did. And I think why it's here too is that it's such good writing. Like, literally, the literary devices used are so great. It reads like a Shakespearean tragedy, like a play, except it's not. It's prose, it's a novel, and I cannot get over it. It's been like a year now and I still am not over how this book is written. This one I don't see myself in as much as the other ones, I think, but it does really draw a lot of attention to how you're living your life and love and romance and tragedy, and it's just, it really just makes you think about a lot of things, and I could write essays about this book. So next on our list, kind of going off of the dark vibes, this is Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. It's a horror book. I don't know if you heard me correctly, it's a horror book. It's scary, it's creepy. I read it in a weekend and I think I spent the whole time screaming because it's so intense and weird. And I know I've talked about this before. A lot of people don't like this book. I've read reviews where people didn't understand it, didn't appreciate it, didn't think it was that good. And I did not have that experience, so I feel like I need to take a moment and like tell you that they're wrong. It's not for everybody, I will say that. Most of these books are not for everybody. There are some of them that are going to be too complex, they're too creepy, they're too weird, they take too much work, there's not enough payoff, whatever. But I think it's good when people try to read them because they really flex your brain in a way that most other books don't. So this book is all about a boy named Christopher. He and his mother run away basically to this small town in Pennsylvania where they're running away from an abusive relationship. And so Christopher walks into the woods one day and he's gone for a whole week and no one knows where he went. He doesn't even know where he went, and he comes back with an imaginary friend. And that's not what this book is about. That's the premise. That's like the first half basically. But like the actual underlying message and the story and the second half is just not about that at all. And so this is another one of those high concept books that I went into it not knowing a lot. I didn't know what to expect. And by the end of it, I saw my life flash before my eyes, and I reconsidered everything I knew about the world. And I think a lot of people, when they talk about this book, especially Stephen, he talks about this all the time, that like there's this underlying heart. There's like a really great heart, even though it's a spooky horror story. And it's kind of like The Haunting of Hill House, if you've seen that TV show, where you think you're getting one horror story, but it's actually not really a horror story. That's not what it's about. That's not the whole point of it. And so that is why it's on this list for me, because it has this feeling deep inside it that like, not a lot of people are gonna get, you're not gonna, if you don't put in the work at the beginning, you're not gonna get to the end where you actually like understand everything and you figure out, oh, that's what they're talking about. That's the whole point of the story. And so it's another book that I hope to reread one day, because I think the more you read it, the more you understand it and the more you can draw from it. But man, I could write some goddamn essays about this book. It's so good, and people don't appreciate it, and I don't know why. So speaking of horror, this is an older book. I read it a couple of years ago, and I still think about it all the time. It is called Night Film by Marisha Pessl. I read this back in 2016, so it was a long time ago now. But the concept for this book, and the reason why a lot of people read it when it came out, is that it's about this fictional horror cult film director. And that's not really what it's about, but that's kind of what it's about. So it's about this filmmaker named Cordova, and ultimately what happens is his daughter ends up dead, and it's ruled a suicide, but a lot of people think that he might have killed her, that she died from something relating to his followers and his cult followers or whatever. And so there's a journalist who's really fascinated by Cordova, who decides that he's going to go investigate. He's going to figure out what happened to this girl. Did Cordova kill her? Didn't he? Did she commit suicide? We don't know. So there's a lot of heavy topics. It's really, really dark. There's a couple segments towards the end that get really, really freaky and scary. But ultimately, it's not about that. This is kind of like a beginner's guide to ergodic literature. So if you've never heard of that phrase, I will be touching on it more in the next couple of books. But I think this is technically in that line of literature, because it's a book that has a lot of mixed media and things that you can't just read the book straight through to understand it. There's like a lot of clues that are hidden, and a lot of work to go in and read this book. But like I said, this is kind of a beginner's ergodic literature, because it's actually not as complex as some of the books that I've read. But if you're interested in getting into that genre, I think this is a great book to start with, because it's easier. So these last two books are great examples of ergodic literature, and I think for the most part, these are the types of books that I'm always searching for more of, because they're so weird and they're so few, and not a lot of people have read them. And if you're like, Jenna, what does that mean? Well, you keep saying it. What is ergodic literature? Ergodic literature is so convoluted and complex and difficult to read, and it takes so much energy, and there's not really a lot of payoff most of the time. It's written in weird ways, is basically how I can explain it best to you. A great example would be S by J.J. Abrams and Doug Dorse. This book came out a couple of years ago, and it was really big on BookTube because, again, it's really high concept and it's very weirdly written. So it's not just a normal book. You think it's normal. It's not. It's basically like stories within stories, and so there's like a main underlying book, like the book Ship of Theseus. But within that book, there is also a story within a story. So there's writing in the margins, and this is a story within itself, that you read the writing in the margins, and that's part of a story. And then there's also like another story that you're kind of trying to figure out who the author of this book is. And so there's just like layers on layers, and it's so convoluted. It's very pretentious. It's really difficult to read because you have no idea how to read it or what's going on. There's a lot of forums about this. If you go on Reddit, there's all kinds of people who are trying to figure it out. This one also comes with like added bonus things. So there's like handwritten notes, and there's a decoder that I still don't know how to use. And it's just really complicated. It's overtly complicated for no reason. But that's also kind of the point. That's kind of the point of ergodic literature, that it's so pretentious and it makes no sense. But if you put in the time and effort, you might understand like a quarter of what's happening. So if you want to know what S is about, I read this while we were in lockdown, and it was brilliant. I don't think the payoff of this one is quite as good as some of the other ones, but I still think about it all the time because I think it's so well done. The amount of effort and work that went into this book, I think, is really what just puts it over the edge for me. Even though it was a concept created by J.J. Abrams, he was one of the initial people who wanted to write this. Like, the actual writing is done by Doug Dorst, and I cannot express to you how difficult it must have been. Like, I am just forever in awe of his work. So originally the concept, J.J. Abrams wanted to write a story about these two people who exchange notes in the margin of a book and like have that be a story. And of course, as with most creative projects, it became so much more complex than that. So the story itself, which was written by Doug Dorst, is Ship of Theseus. And so it's written by this author who is mysterious, and he has a number of different works. And it's kind of like a Night Film in the sense that he has a lot of cult followers, but nobody really knows who he is or what any of it means. And a lot of people think it's like analogies for his life, and people are trying to figure out who he is. And so this story, Ship of Theseus, is Straka's book about this man named S who doesn't remember who he is. So he has amnesia, and he winds up on this ship, and he's very confused. And so you're trying to figure out what's going on. There's a lot of spies. It's kind of magical, but not really. There's pirates, there's monkeys, there's just like a lot of random stuff. Don't really know what it means. On top of that, people in our world are trying to figure out who the author Straka is. And so most of the mystery of the book is, who is Straka? What is his actual like life story? And then on top of that, the story in the margins, which is kind of like the main story and my favorite part of the book. It's about these two college students who are basically sending this library book back and forth between the two of them. And one of them has been studying Straka for years and loves this book. And so he has really added a lot of notes to it. And then the second student just finds this book out of the blue and reads it and starts writing in it. And she's like, oh my God, this is the best thing I've ever read. I'm going to read all of Straka's books. And so the two of them kind of become involved in this weird plot of mystery and intrigue and spies and all this stuff. And so at the end of the day, it's you trying to solve all these mysteries. And so you have to figure out, there's many different ways to read it. A lot of people have debated this. You can read it, the like book Ship of Theseus, straight through, and then you can read the margins straight through. You can read them at the same time. You can read a couple chapters at a time. Like, there's literally so much you can do. One of the problems people have is it does take a lot of work, and it's a lot of thinking, and then at the end there may not be as much payoff as you want. I don't think the payoff is that great. I think there are issues that I have with it that I wish I knew more, but part of the story is the mystery. And so that's one of the reasons why I love it so much, is because you're never going to have all the answers, but that's part of the fun. Like, it is fun to sit through and read a note on really nice paper. Like, the production value on this book, it's insane, and I'm obsessed with it. But this is a great example of ergodic literature, because you have to put in all this work. Is it worth it? It may or may not be worth it. It's super pretentious and convoluted, and you aren't going to understand all of it, even if you read it 20 times, because it makes no sense. There's so much joy in reading a book like this, because it's inspired by story, and it's about story, and it's a love letter to writing and stuff like that. And I think for me, I love these books so much because you can tell that the author really like put in a lot of work, and like there's a lot there. Even if the payoff may not be great, I think most of it I put on me not understanding it more than the book like failing to do its job, which I think is all a matter of perspective. There's a lot of people who will read these types of books who will be like, I didn't understand it, and the book should make me understand it, you know? And it's like, I think you should have to go to a forum on Reddit and figure out what it means. So that brings me to the last book on our list, which is, it's a beast. It's literally a beast. I was warned against this book, but also I was told to read it by so many people. It's very, very obscure. Not a lot of people have read it. And the people who have read it, I feel like, are either extreme fans or they're terrified of it. It's called House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you've seen this at a bookstore. I saw it at a bookstore once, and I didn't know what I was getting into. This is arguably S is really, really difficult to read. It takes a lot of energy, and it's very complex, and I still don't understand it. This one is like S on steroids. It makes even less sense, and yet it was easier for me to understand. I don't know how to tell you that. So House of Leaves, I need to make a whole video about it because it's so weird. It was written in 2000. It has a cult following. There's lots of forums about it. It is, a lot of people say it's one of the scariest books ever written. It's terrifying. I have had friends who are like, I had to get it out of my house because it was so terrifying. Like, it has bad vibes, it has bad juju, whatever. And I get that because it is weird and it is scary, but it's not the scariest book I've ever read. Maybe I'm just turning into a horror fanatic. I don't know. So House of Leaves is stories within stories, but the main way I can describe it is it's about this guy and his family who move into a house, and the house is bigger on the inside. And I know if you've seen Doctor Who, you're like, this is great, this is good. Like, I'm excited about that. It's not like Doctor Who. It's scarier than Doctor Who. But again, part of why this is ergodic literature is because it's written as a literary paper. As you can tell, this is exactly what a literary paper looks like. No, but this one is written kind of as a literary paper, even though it doesn't always look like that. And so it has a lot of footnotes. And the footnotes are what make it so difficult to read because you basically are just flipping back and forth. You have to go to the appendix at certain points. There's so much. I can't even explain to you, like, I can't explain what this reading experience was for me, but it was so weird and so creepy, but also so fun. And again, it's this high concept novel that once you get to the end of it, like, the concept is not what it's about. It has a deeper underlying message. And then when you figure out that message, you go on Reddit and you read the forums and you figure out that that's not what it's about. So in conclusion, I think this book is not for everybody. I think a lot of people will be terrified by it. And I think there's a lot of trigger warnings that should happen. It's very disturbing at times. But I think it's so interesting. And especially if you like horror and if you like having to work at your book, like, people make it seem that it's really hard to read. And I will admit, it's not super easy. It takes a lot to get into it. Once you get past a couple hundred pages, it works. But it's really not that hard. Like, I thought it was really, really an enjoyable reading experience. People talk all the time about having to use mirrors to read it and whatever. And like, you put in what you want to put in, you know, you can try and read every single word. For me, there was a lot of it that I skimmed over because I didn't really want to read every single footnote or whatever. But there is actually a story in it, and I think the story itself is pretty easy to read. So don't let it intimidate you. I would say read Night Film before you read House of Leaves because I think they're kind of precursors. But House of Leaves should not be scary. It's really, really good. And it made me feel things that I can't explain. So anyway, in conclusion, this is a type of book that I'm always looking for. If you know books like this, let me know. I have done research on some other ergodic literature books, which I may or may not be checking out sometime. Yeah, these are books that I think are perfect for autumn. They're really, really difficult. A lot of times they're hard to understand and they're not for everybody. But if you have a strong heart, if you have a strong brain, and you really want to think, and you want to think about the universe, I would recommend checking out any and/or all of these books. They've really changed my life. I think about them all the time. Let me know in the comments if you've read any more ergodic literature, whether I mentioned or I didn't mention. And if you want to hear me make a full video about any of these books, please let me know because I will do that for you. Cool. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye!